Thank you. Welcome all. Welcome all. We're delighted to see you all here again, particularly on this occasion, which is everybody here knows, at least those who are members of the committee knows, is the 75th anniversary this year of the Bretton Woods Conference. And we're delighted to have our annual meeting here. And we have a very good program, starting off with the Secretary of the Treasury, who will join us shortly. And I'm not going to take time to talk about the Bretton Woods Conference now. I'll try to fit it in later. I think those of you who are members of the committee have been getting updates as we go along through the year. A lot has been happening and a lot more will be coming. We're working on that collection of essays by prominent people about the Bretton Woods Conference, about the Bretton Woods mission, and about where the Bretton Woods mission will be going in the future, which is the important part of it all. As you know, it's a very relevant subject these days, where a lot of the world is topsy-turvy, trying to find a good route to follow for the future. So with that, I'll begin with introducing briefly Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Minuchin, who will join us any minute, and also Greg Ip, who will moderate his session. And it will be on the international multilateral institutions, i.e. those created by the Bretton Woods Conference many years ago, and who are still not only surviving, and there was some doubt for it many years ago, but they're thriving. And we'd like to hear more about how our Secretary of the Treasury thinks about them and their future. And with that, if the Secretary is available, I will stop talking. And if not, I'll continue talking. 30 seconds. Yeah. All I want to do, again and again, I'm going to do this, I'll bore you to death. We have to recognize the mission of the Bretton Woods Conference. We have to do that. It's very important. And we will do it in many ways, and we'll culminate, as you all know, with a dinner in the fall meeting of the bank and the fund in October. But between now and then, we're going to have a series of meetings. We're also working on this compendium of essays by some very prominent contributors on the not just the history, but where we go from here. What has the Bretton Woods mission taught us? What's good about it? What's weak about it? What's good about what's going on today? What's bad about what's going on today? So with that, I'll try for another break if it's 30 seconds.
You're on. He's on. He's ready. He's ready. Right behind you. Coming in.
Mr. Secretary. Bravo.
Thanks very much for joining us today, Mr. Secretary. I know it's been a busy time for you, so we'll sort of get right into it. So 75 years ago, your predecessor, Secretary Morgenthau, met in Bretton Woods, and those conferences led to the creation of what we now call the international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Are they, and the creation of what we now call the International Rules-Based Order. Are those institutions and that order as relevant and important today as they were then?
I think they are. First, let me say it's a pleasure to be here with you, so thank you. I think that the IMF and the World Bank are both very important institutions, as important today as they've ever been. Look forward to working with the new World Bank president, David Malpass, who I've worked with very closely for the last 3 years. Look forward to his leadership there. And I've had a very productive relationship with Christine Lagarde, and we're working with her, as you know, on the issue of capital at the IMF and IMF reforms, and we hope we make a lot of progress on this in the near future.
So from this administration, you sometimes hear criticism that globalization has gone too far and these institutions have overstepped the bounds. How do you reconcile that more sort of muscular America, make America first agenda with the continued relevance of these institutions?
Well, I think that it both makes sense. What President Trump has said, and he's been very clear on, he's been elected because of the American public and the American worker, and it's his job and our job to support the American economy and the American worker. And we couldn't be more proud. The American economy is the bright spot of global growth. There's plenty of times that it makes sense for us to work with our counterparts and do that through the IMF and the World Bank and other institutions. But we do that in a way knowing that our primary objective is the American economy. And I think, as you know, specifically on trade, this has been an area where we feel like it has not been a level playing field, and our objective is to make sure we have free and fair trade in both directions.
So thinking now about the IMF and the World Bank, what are your priorities for these organizations? You obviously believe they're still relevant. How do they need to change to stay relevant?
Well, I think in both of the institutions, we've worked on prioritization, reforms, and capital. So these are important to both organizations. I think the World Bank and the IMF play different roles. There's certain places where they overlap. But I would just say, there's many parts of the world. Start first talking about the World Bank. Obviously, we're looking for significant changes in Venezuela. This is an area where the economy, the people in Venezuela have suffered. I see the World Bank and the IMF as being major parts of rebuilding this. We've been working on trying to reach an agreement with North Korea on something that could be very good for the economy and the people of North Korea. I see these institutions playing an active role there. And if we're successful in working on Middle East peace, this is something that's been going on for a long time, but I think, as a priority, I think, again, the economic agenda in the Middle East, particularly for the World Bank, can play a very significant role.
So you've talked about places where World Bank resources could be very helpful, but you've also said in the past that you think that they put some resources where they're not helpful. And you have specifically talked about the World Bank's lending to China, and you'd like to see less of that. Where do we stand with respect to that agenda item?
Well, first of all, obviously, we're having very productive discussions with China on a whole range of economic issues. China is the second largest economy in the world. I think we're looking for the World Bank really to help poor countries that don't have access to capital. China has significant access to capital. And we're very focused on debt transparency. This is an issue we've talked to China about and others, and we're focused on both at the IMF and World Bank. We want to make sure that there is proper debt transparency, that where there are investments, again, they're transparent.
Does it remain a priority of the Treasury and of the new World Bank president, your former colleague David Malpass, that China graduate out of World Bank development programs?
Well, I think we have various different reforms we put in, including on pricing and other things. I'd say it's less of a focus of whether they graduate or they don't graduate. We want to make sure that the resources are being used in other areas that need the resources better. Now, I would say, in terms of technical assistance, I think that's something that the World Bank can continue to work on with China. I think in terms of debt transparency, that's something that's good for China and good for the World Bank. So there definitely will be areas where the World Bank and China can work together, and it makes sense.
Okay, that's great. Let's talk a little bit about the IMF now. So the IMF and many of its members have for some time felt that the organization needs more permanent capital, i.e. quota. What's your position on that right now?
Well, first of all, let me just say, we've been having very productive conversations with Christine Lagarde. I think I have 20 or 30 bilats set up over the next few days, so I look forward to...
All with her?
No, not all with her. With all of my various counterparts, and this will be one of the things. The first issue we have to reach an agreement on is the size of the balance sheet and the resources. And we want to make sure that the IMF has the necessary resources, not only for today, but for unforeseen circumstances. And I think that's something we're going to have an agreement on. And then the second issue is kind of what's the structure of those resources. And again, it can be a combination of quota, NABs, and potentially bilateral situations.
But are you perhaps a little bit more open to the possibility that a quota increase might be in order?
Again, I want to be careful. It would be inappropriate for me to negotiate these things in a broader issue. I would say that we are fully supportive that the IMF has the necessary resources. We don't think it necessarily has to be in quota increases. There's other ways that it can be done. And as the largest shareholder, obviously we have a big interest in this and supporting them.
Well, speaking of which, as the largest shareholder, the United States also has a veto. Do you wish to should the United States keep that veto?
Of course. We absolutely have no intention whatsoever of giving up the veto.
Why is that? Why is that so important?
We have been, this has been an important issue since the founding of the IMF. We've been the largest supporter from day one. That's something we've had. And I think that the U.S.'s leadership, and again, I think we'll be careful how we ever use that veto. It's not something that we'd use without being very prudent. But it's something that we have and something we've negotiated. And as you can expect, it's something we expect to continue to keep.
Of course, one of the issues that folks have raised is that, like, you have a lot of rapidly growing emerging markets. Their economies are a lot larger. They carry a lot more economic weight in the world today than they did, 20, 30 years ago when quota was last sort of arranged as it is today. And under the current quota structure, the IMF's voting power cannot reflect those countries' relatively increased economic weight. The concern is that over time, that undercuts the legitimacy of the IMF and possibly drives those emerging economic powers into the arms of other regional arrangements. Is that a concern?
I don't see that as a concern at all, but I would just say that there are other regional players. There are other development banks. I think it's important for the World Bank and others to work together. I think to the extent there's capital in the world that can help underdeveloped countries, that's something we should all be working together. And there's no exclusivity on that. So it doesn't mean that the World Bank or the IMF has to be any specific lender. I think there will be partnerships.
Let's talk a little bit about the world economy. As you know, the IMF released its economic outlook this year, and it was somewhat downbeat. It lowered the outlook for a lot of parts of the world, as you know. They also lowered the outlook for the United States. They now see 2.3% growth this year. That's a downgrade from 2.5% just a few months ago. Do you agree? Do you think that the U.S. outlook has gotten a little darker in the last few months?
I don't, but let me just, I want to put this in perspective.
Sure.
First of all, last year, the administration projection was significantly higher than the consensus, whether it was at the IMF or others, and we outperformed it. I think that the outlook for the U.S. economy is still quite robust. I think it's a result of the economic policies that the president has put in place, the tax cuts, regulatory relief, and trade. Having said that, there's no question that the U.S. is the bright spot of economic growth, and there's no question, this meeting today versus when I was sitting here 6 months ago in other parts of the world with my counterparts, there's no question that growth outside the United States has slowed down, whether it's in China or whether it's in Europe, and that's something that is going to have some modest impact on U.S. growth. But there's no question that the U.S. continues to outperform the rest of the world.
So we just came off of a 2% quarter, the fourth quarter. Forecasters are now looking at another 2% quarter. That suggests that we're going to have a fairly significant acceleration to reach the administration's 3% forecast for this year. Do you think that acceleration is going to happen? Do you see that?
Well, I would just comment.
Yeah.
The first quarter of GDP is always traditionally lower because of the way the first quarter is accounted for. So I wouldn't put too much focus on the first quarter per se. I would say the inflation numbers look very attractive in the U.S. The job numbers continue to look very attractive. The investment numbers, we continue to see a lot of investment coming into the U.S. So we're really focused on overall economic activity, and I expect we'll have robust economic growth for the year.
Okay. The IMF says that one of the major reasons for their growth downgrade and one of the continued threats to the outlook is trade tensions, in particular between the U.S. and China. You've obviously been part of the American team meeting with your Chinese counterparts to hammer out a bilateral agreement. Where do we stand? Are we going to have a deal by the informal end of April deadline?
Well, President Trump has been very clear in saying to us it's more important that we get this right than we pick an arbitrary date. I can tell you we are literally working round the clock, and when I say round the clock, that's not just an expression. Ambassador Lighthizer and I had a call with the Vice Premier last night that lasted a very long period of time.
What did you talk about?
We're having many issues, which I'm happy to comment on.
Yeah.
We have a call scheduled for tomorrow morning. We're alternating between nights and mornings. And let me just comment, I think that Ambassador Lighthizer and the entire team at USTR, and we have an enormous number of people across the interagencies, have really done a great job. If we're able to get this done, and there still are some very significant issues, but if we're able to get this done, this will be the most significant change in the economic relationship with China and the U.S., which will be very good for both countries and will rebalance the trading relationship. Will open up structural changes in the China economy to make them more competitive, which I think will be very good for their growing middle class.
And what did you talk about last night? Did you make progress on any of the sticking points?
Yeah, I would say we're making a lot of progress, but there's still more work to do. This is, I think there's 7 different chapters addressing very complicated issues. We're literally going line by line through an agreement. We've talked about everything from an enforcement mechanism to an enforcement office. This is a very, very detailed agreement that has dealt with more issues than have ever been dealt with before in the relationship of the 2 largest economies. So I'm cautiously hopeful we can reach an agreement. I'd say we've successfully reached an agreement with Mexico and Canada. We're hopeful that this gets taken up in Congress and passed. Again, very major trading relationships for us. Very important for our economies, our farmers, our workers.
You said enforcement office. What would that be?
Well, again, we want to make sure that this is an agreement that on both sides is enforced. So we will have a process on both sides with significant resources to focus on issues as they come up.
Will it be like a joint office with the U.S. and China contributing?
It would be premature for me to comment on the specifics of it, but the reason why I wanted to bring it up was just to emphasize the commitment that both sides have. If we're able to reach an agreement, we understand that this is a very important agreement that ultimately will be signed off on by both presidents, and a very important relationship between the 2 countries.
So one issue that's specifically important to Treasury is currency, of course, and I think you and the President have said how it's important that one aspect of this agreement limit the ability of China to devalue for competitive purposes. Can you tell me what you're trying to achieve there and what progress you've made?
I think we've made a lot of progress on the currency chapter. I think that this chapter is basically complete. Again, I think it would be inappropriate for me to comment on all the specifics of it, but you've highlighted the most important issue is that there are G20 commitments, whether it's China or other countries. We expect that people will honor their commitments not to devalue their currency for competitive purposes.
So, in other words, you have more or less come to an agreement on the currency part of
that chapter is pretty much done.
And is there an enforcement mechanism to that?
There is, and I would say this would be one of the strongest currency agreements we've reached.
Would it require some kind of methodology for
I want to be careful. Again, I think we're in the midst of a whole bunch of issues. I want to give you a little bit of color, but again, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on the specifics.
So what color would the chapter be, for example? The color of money? That's right. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. You've been.
We'll take your suggestion and we'll make that a green chapter.
It'll be green here. It'll be red in China, I suppose. Like a purple in between, I guess, when the two of you meet. Thinking more broadly, what is the end game with respect to China? You hear some discussion that these economies need to decouple. Think about where we are 5 years from now. If the world unfolds the way the administration wants it to, will the Chinese and U.S. economies be as intertwined then as they are today?
Well, I think the number one objective we have across all of our trading partners is that we have fair and free trade, which we believe will lead to balanced trade. I think you know the United States has a very significant goods deficit. And a big reason for that is in many cases, we have a very free and open market for both goods as well as investments. And many other countries put up barriers to our products. So what we're looking to do is create more free and balanced relationships. I think one of the things that's been very helpful is there's been a lot of investment into the United States for more manufacturing in the United States. But whether it's Europe or whether it's China, we just want to compete fairly. And as the market in China grows, as I said, particularly their middle class, our companies, we believe, will be able to compete very fairly. Agriculture, I think, as you know, is a very big export for the United States. This is something that's very important to China. Medical systems, medical technology, this is something that China needs, as well as many other products for a large growing middle class.
All right, so let's continue talking about the economy. Clearly, one of the major factors in where the economy goes this year is monetary policy. The president has said he believes that monetary policy is too tight. The Federal Reserve should lower interest rates. It should resume quantitative easing. Do you agree?
Well, I respect the president's views, but I think, as you can appreciate, in my role as Treasury Secretary, it would be inappropriate for me to specifically comment on monetary policy. I meet with Chairman Powell on a weekly basis, and I follow the precedent of other Treasury secretaries. Although we meet and we talk to each other about these issues, I don't publicly comment on them.
Do you still trust Chairman Powell to get it right?
I do trust Chairman Powell to get it right, but let me just comment.
Sure.
When one says get it right, okay, whether it's the Federal Reserve or any other central bank or anyone else, the models are never perfect. So one of the things I like is Chairman Powell has consistently said that they are going to be focused on the data. And, you know, I think that's something we're all looking at. Now, the good news is the inflation data right now is very good. We have very low inflation. We have very good jobs. So we'll see how the Fed continues to react.
Is Chairman Powell's job safe?
I see no reason why his job isn't safe.
Okay, so you're obviously aware the president would like to nominate two individuals to the Board of Governors, Stephen Moore and Herman Cain. Questions have arisen about whether they have the right qualifications. Can you comment on that? Are these, do these individuals have the right qualifications to serve on the Fed?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just comment. It is the president's job to nominate people to the Fed. So people talk about this like there's some political aspect. It's the president's job to send these nominations, like anything else, to the Senate. I know Stephen Moore well. I think Stephen contributed significantly to our economic programs. I worked with him on the campaign. I don't know Mr. Cain nearly as well, but I have every reason to believe the president knows him, and I respect the president's views, so I expect they will both be very good members of the board.
And as members of the board, would you expect them to put the Fed's mission first as opposed to what they may perceive to be the president's priorities?
Again, I think the president's priorities and the Fed's priorities are really not any different. They're both very focused. The president's focus is on economic growth, making sure that the economic expansion continues. The president sees strong growth, low inflation. So again, I think fundamentally, again, the Fed and the president don't necessarily have different objectives.
So I realize that you do not wish to comment on monetary policy. However, let me ask you a question about monetary regimes, because one thing that both Mr. Moore and Mr. Cain have talked about is how they would like to see monetary policy oriented towards maintaining stability in commodity prices or gold. You know, they've actually toyed with the idea of a return to the gold standard. What do you think? Should the U.S. be considering a return to the gold standard or some kind of commodity standard?
Well, let me just say, I did go visit the gold at Fort Knox in the New York Fed. I wanted to make sure that the Treasury's gold was still there in good hands. Nobody had been to Fort Knox, I think, in about 30 years. And I'm happy to report our gold is in good shape. We got plenty
of it. Are you sure?
Did
you count it?
But I didn't count it, but it has been counted. Okay. But no, I do not see the United States going back to the gold standard. I personally don't think that makes sense. I think most economists don't think that makes sense. I can't comment on either one of their views. I don't necessarily they think that we should have the gold standard. But we do like having our gold.
That's right. Well, I will say that there was a time, in fact, the Bretton Woods Committee was actually founded around a standard that required us to have that gold to maintain the value of the dollar. So realize you're not tying yourself to it, but you might want to hold on to it just in case somebody gets nostalgic. Just a little bit of free advice. Okay, we've talked about monetary policy. Let's talk a little bit about fiscal policy. So the president's budget proposes that discretionary spending this fall will return to the sequester levels. That is a 10% drop in the domestic side. Is that a line that the president intends to enforce in budget negotiations this year? So
let me just put this in perspective, and I'm glad you brought this up. I think you know, under the prior administration, the national debt basically doubled. I am very comfortable in where we are in terms of our debt to GDP now, but this is something we got to be careful and look at and make sure that the debt doesn't grow disproportionate to GDP growth. So the first thing the president was very focused when he came into office was on economic growth and military spending. The president felt like we had very significant issues around the world. We had underinvested in our military. These were two priorities. In an effort to get our military increases, the Democrats required non-military increases. The president, now that we've made that investment and we've caught up, the president wants to make sure we're prudent on spending. And the president has looked at modest decreases in non-defense spending, and that's something I fully support. Whether we end up going through the sequester process or not, I think given the increases we've had in non-military spending, it's prudent that we cut back on it slightly. And again, we're only talking about slight reductions. This still will be, over a multi-year period, significant increases from budgets that we've had not long ago. Something where I think you might be in some agreement with the IMF is they have argued that countries that with very strong surplus positions need to do more to stimulate their own economies. Germany, if you're here, I think we're talking about you. What do you think? Should other countries be doing more to use their macroeconomic tools? This is an area I fully support the IMF's views. Okay, thank you. We have just a few minutes. Let me talk just a couple quick questions on an issue I'm sure you're tired of hearing about. But the House set a deadline of today for you to respond to their request to supply them with the president's tax returns. Will you have an answer for them today? So let me just comment. There's obviously a lot of interest in this topic. I spent yesterday, I think, about 6 or 7 hours on the Hill testifying. Although I went to testify on our budget and I testified on our NAC report, there was a disproportionate amount of interest in other issues. We are working on a response. Let me just make the comment, and I've said this before. I take this issue very seriously, and I have every intention to follow the law. But I would also just say, in following the law, this is an issue that we are consulting with the Justice Department on. We are going to respond carefully on. We need to make sure that the IRS and individual taxpayers' information does not just become subject to political wills. And whether it's this party or a different party over time, I take the obligation very seriously to make sure that we follow the law correctly. I think, as you can imagine, if Kevin Brady, when he was chairman, had requested individual tax returns of prominent Democrats, whether they be in the government or outside, the uproar that would have created. So is the possibility of creating a precedent here an issue that you're weighing? I would just say I think getting this right and following the law is an issue that's very important, and I want to make sure we're very careful in analyzing the issues. Mr. Secretary, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks.
We're changing the furniture, so this gives me an opportunity to say something more about my favorite topic, and that is the anniversary year for the Bretton Woods Committee and the Bretton Woods Conference. You saw a lot of what was discussed in the beginning here about the continuing mission being carried out today as a result of what happened in 1944. And 1944, in my view, was they call it a game changer today. It did change the way the world operated. Prior to that, it was a rather chaotic situation, certainly in the first half of the last century. And those people who met in New Hampshire in 1944, before the war was over, just created something that was entirely different from what had been happening in the decade before. And I think, and what is the essence of it? The essence is basically the benefits of international financial and economic cooperation. That's what it gets down to. It goes beyond that as well. It goes beyond the fields of finance and economics, but it certainly has a social impact, that's for sure. But what's going on, and it has survived all of these years, the basic tenets are there. We had a little dip in the Nixon administration when the idea of multilateralism was sort of put aside, and we got a little isolationist. But beyond that, and we recovered from that very fast, the world, not just the U.S., has followed the mission, followed the objectives, followed the targets. So here we are today, and we all know where we are if you read the newspapers. And the question is, what do we do now? How do we face the frill now? Will we continue? Will we continue to improve it? Will we take another course? Will we abandon it? But I think we should recognize that it has been a course of action that we have been following. And if we're going to change it, if the world is going to change it, and that change is happening at the margins, we've got to know where we're going. So with that in mind, that's why we have this this celebration and this compendium of essays on the subject. And with that, I think Mr. Ocampo will you, by the way, you all have this. I haven't gone to any trouble to introduce speakers or anything like that. It's all in the book. So I won't start now, except I should thank the IMF for having us here again in their premises. It's great to be here. And I should also thank the supporters of this anniversary, who are Morgan Stanley and Mizuho, as well as SIPCA, who have supported us over the years and have made sure that we have the resources to carry out what we're talking about. And with that, are they ready? Good. Ocampo. Good. Good.
So let me thank very much the Bretton Woods Committee for this invitation, to share this, excellent panel on the global economy of tomorrow. Little topic. And let me start by introducing our panelists. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of the Republic of Liberia. Andrew Cheng, Distinguished Fellow of the Asian Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong, and Seila Pasarbasoglu, Vice President of the World Bank for Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions. Let me start by a general question and then ask a few individual questions to the three panelists. So the first big question is, what do you perceive as the critical issues going forward? Issues that encompass, I would say, a technological change going on in the world today, a climate change, a major threat for the world, but also the demographic changes, which are different, as I will ask a question to President Sirleaf, for South Africa, or for sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is increasing very fast, versus the rest of the world, where it's aging very fast now. So the very different trends. And I will probably add to this what you can call the crisis of multilateralism in the context of changes in the world power structures, let's say, that is going on today. So in this context, what do you perceive as the big challenge, the way to go forward in a very constructive way for the global economy? Then let me start by a couple of specific questions to former President Sirleaf. One, actually, which is very dear also to my country, Colombia, which is the peace building, which was a major effort that you did in your country as a foundation for economic development. So how do you perceive this issue in the countries that are still going through conflict or trying to build up post-conflict situations? And a specific issue that relates also to the demographic changes and the big challenges of sub-Saharan Africa, which relate actually to the growing labor force. According to the African Development Bank, sub-Saharan Africa has to create 12 million jobs a year to absorb the labor force that is growing, and I would say probably even more if you take into account the high levels of informality that exist in most countries. So in that context, how do you perceive the economic engines of growth that can generate that amount of employment?
Well, let me first say all the challenges of the future are all of those you've mentioned. Technological change is moving at such a fast pace that is bound to leave a lot of countries behind in the cases where there are infrastructure deficit. Climate change is creating such catastrophic consequences right now that this stands the potential of undermining much of the development, reversals in much of the progress that's been made by so many countries. But more importantly, perhaps, the demographics. Many of our countries have a youth bulge. These are young people 35 years and under, forming 60% of population in so many countries. Many of them educated, but not unable to secure jobs. These are young people that are getting restless. They are the ones that could challenge the peace and stability of nations, looking for opportunities and thereby trying to find those opportunities wherever they can go. And so the challenges that the World Bank and IMF will face in trying to respond to these are real, and things that will have to be addressed in very quickly if we're not going to see many of these countries that have made so much progress with the support of these institutions face some difficult times. I also believe that the challenge of global dynamics, partnerships, isolationism that we're facing, populism that are reversing, how will this impact the future, and how will the World Bank and IMF respond to these? Multilateralism would then be threatened, and what would be the response to that? And we have to look at where these institutions have taken our countries. When the two institutions were established after World War II, there was a purpose. The purpose was the reconstruction of Europe, to enable Europe once again to become a global power, making contribution to world development, and it succeeded. We haven't had that success except in few places like Korea, in which the size and timing of development has been able to meet the needs and to therefore provide the means for transformation of those economies. So again, in the future, will the bank and fund be able to change its procedures, the method of delivering aid, the uniformity of its policies, the conditionality that accompany those policies? Will we be able to change to make sure that we do deliver the kind of support in the size and scale that is necessary to make countries that have struggled? The debt question has been great. I mean, the experience of Liberia has been good. We've had great partnership with the IMF and World Bank. That has enabled us to address a $4.9 billion external debt. It's enabled us to rebuild infrastructure that had been destroyed over years of conflict. It's been good. But we haven't got that scale of support to enable us to make it. And so our institutions have not been built. And that means the kind of support for institutions that are independent, that are capacitated, that go beyond political influence. And that's building our public service, our civil service, giving them the training and the systems, the technology that enable them to be able to stand and to continue to have continuity even when there's political succession. That's what the future of these institutions are really going to be challenged unless we can see this kind of partnership of equality, more equality, partnership in recognizing the ownership of those that are being provided the support, and putting them really in charge of development, giving them the primary responsibility to be in charge of development, but giving them the size of support, the dynamism of support that they need to really transform. Otherwise, my country, one of fragility, like so many others, will find ourselves in a state of fragility for generations, not able to make the transformation that we know we all want to see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let me, aside from the general question, ask a couple of additional questions to Professor Shang. The first one is, I mean, you are from the part of the world that has had the most dynamic developing countries over the past 30 to 40 years. So how do you perceive are the major challenges to avoid a stronger slowdown of your part of the world, aside from the other issues that are being discussed quite extensively in the economic literature today, like the middle income trap, in which I said my part of the region seems to be trapped, actually. And the second question relating actually to China. I mean, China is clearly emerging as or is already a major power. How do you see as it faces its own challenges of development, how do you see it engaging with the multilateral institutions?
Well, I think this session is fabulous because it talks about the global economy of tomorrow. And I want to answer the questions that you've posed in a longer historical context. What was the context of Bretton Woods 75 years ago, 76 years ago? The answer is, it was the globalization view of the New Deal. America, under FDR, had a New Deal to deal with climate change, unemployment, trade problems, okay, and recovery. Then he applied this from 1934 to 44 for a global Marshall Plan, the recovery of the world. This 75 years, Asia has been the major beneficiary of that view, no doubt about it. China has grown to be the second largest economy, 1/5 of mankind. India, in 10 years' time, will be a very major power, right? ASEAN is 600 million people, most of which are growing at more than 5%, holding up the present estimates of 3+% growth for the world. But if Asia goes through the same growth and consumption levels of Western Europe and America, there will be no new resources left in the world. The same issue about resource constraints that we all face. And climate change is the major issue that we face in the next 75 years. So my answer back to you is this. What is the new vision for Bretton Woods? Is there going to be a global Green New Deal? If not, are we going to burn up? Do we have a burning platform? That's the heart of the issue. Now, Governor Marcani had this lovely phrase. He said, we're going through a tragedy of horizons, right? Central banks, politicians have horizons of not more than 5 to 8 years. All the issues that President Sirleaf talks about have horizons of a generation. And half a generation, in fact, even 30 years, if we don't deal with some of the problems of climate change, we're going to all burn up. So we actually suffer from a tragedy, to quote Gillian Tett, who is going to moderate later on, a tragedy of silos. We have so many closed-minded silo mentalities. We have a tragedy of paradigms. Our paradigm is the old 75 years. We really need to rethink the new 75 years. How are we going to survive this? Do we have the resources to do this? Right? How is it possible that with QE, we increased central bank balance sheets by $14 trillion during the last 10 years, bringing interest rates to near zero, and we still can't finance climate change and all the inequality infrastructure needs that we need? So can Bretton Woods institutions, under the present constraint of capital, which we're really talking about peanuts, I'm sorry to say this, the amount of resources that Bretton Woods can now bring to the issues that we face today are very small relative to the huge needs that President Sirleaf talks about. And that is the real challenge that we face today. How do we think out of our mental blocks, put it this way, or geographical blocks, into a one world that Bretton Woods would contribute to a green world, a better world for all our children? That's the question I want to pose to you, Jose Antonio.
I cannot answer it because I'm the moderator. So let me ask also an additional question to our Vice President of the World Bank, which relates actually to the more complex world of the multilateral development banks. You have, of course, the World Bank group. You have the regional development banks, which have a long history, actually including the European investment banks, which sometimes is not included in the list, but it's actually the largest of all. But you also have the two new development banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. And you have national development banks that are as large or even larger, like the Chinese Development Bank. Actually the Brazilian Development Bank is KfW, all very large development bank institutions. And you have the increasing demands for many parts of cooperation, including, you say, on two different sides, the infrastructure demands from developing countries, but also the social demands, for example, associated to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. How do you see this world of cooperation between this complex set of institutions to reach the development goals of the future.
Okay, so thank you. It's great to be here with this panel talking about an issue dear to my heart. You asked what is the key concern for us at the bank and myself. The key concern is linked to what was just said. How do we find ways to deal with those that are excluded? And those that are excluded can be the poor. Those that are excluded are the female population. Those that are excluded include disabled and so on. So the key question in my mind is we cannot have sustained growth unless we deal with this issue of addressing and including those that are excluded. Otherwise, we will have the backlash, just like we have against globalization, the backlash against trade, the backlash against many of the discussion and the policy uncertainty that results from it. When we look at, we have at the bank we have our twin goals. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are very critical. And when we look at the historical growth, even if we were to double growth going forward, we're not going to be able to reach these goals unless we do what Andrew was asking about, unless we find a way to leverage the public sector or the development bank and other multilateral institutions to bring in the private sector. Because there's a lot of money in the private sector. There are a lot of funds which are sometimes sitting with negative interest rates. And the key question is, how do we actually mobilize, leverage this money for the global good? And in this context, the exponential change in technology is great. It's a great opportunity, but it's also scary because the digital divide is growing.
Yeah.
Some have access to it and some don't. And to me, that's going to be the biggest problem in 10 years' time. How do we harness technology? How do we make technology inclusive so that the public goods are in place, the infrastructure is in place to allow the private sector to make money by going to the remote corners of the world, which they can make money. But right now, everyone is concerned about the latest iPhone or latest iPad. But those in remote corners of the world could really use digital payments, could really use micro-insurance, nano-mortgage, these technological advances that help us reduce costs, bring efficiency, and so on. How do we make sure that the public sector provides the infrastructure, the public goods? And I think that comes to your specific question. What is the role of multilateral institutions and development banks? I think the key is, yes, the resources of these institutions are small compared to the private sector, compared to some of the national development banks and so on. But these institutions have a long institutional memory of what works in different parts of the world and how that can be tailored. So be it technical assistance, as the Secretary mentioned earlier today, be it lending to either countries or fragile and conflict states which do not have access to private sector funds, is for us as development banks, it's going to be critical. Three things will be critical. One, we need to have the accountability and conscience to make sure that debt is good debt. It's transparent and it's used for good purpose, that it brings good returns. So we don't end up with bad debt or ugly debt. So it's on multilateral institutions to really coordinate and make sure that the money is used for good purpose in countries. Second is for the countries themselves. They are bombarded with a lot of money coming from different directions. To have that money go to good use, that public expenditures are spent for good use. And I think the last issue is to lead by example. We have to be, as development banks, we have to be transparent. We have to disclose what we do so that the others also follow suit.
Well, thank you very much. Let me actually, I guess, continue raising questions on other topics we have not talked about. I mean, actually, maybe you want, Professor Cheng has mentioned that this crisis of multilateralism that we're facing today, which is perceived as such, at least in large parts of the developing world. What do you mean? How do you overcome that crisis in order to give the opportunities for global development? As Professor Cheng was saying, how do we construct for the next 75 years?
Yes, but Jose Antonio, there is no crisis of multilateralism. There is a crisis of unilateralism. There's a shift from a unipolar power to a multiverse world. We really need to understand that the Bretton Woods was the creation of a multilateral infrastructure by a unipower. And that's the very good thing. That was creation of global public goods. Now what we need is a democratic, multiverse multilateralism. It's not a crisis, it's an opportunity. I don't subscribe to the idea that multilateralism is dead. It's not dead. It is more important than ever. Even though I'm critical of the available resources for Bretton Woods, there is no lack of resources in the world. If there was lack of savings, you would not have huge excess capacity with no inflation. Right? So the real issue to me is how do we mobilize it? And unfortunately, exactly as Chela says, we have this old mindset of 75 years. We are, as Keynes said, ruled by dead professors, right? The dead professors who were writing in those days, when Keynes was writing, climate change was not within his perspective, with all due respect to Keynes. Okay? Inequality was very much not on his major horizon. His major horizon during Bretton Woods was how to protect the British Empire's domination of the preservation of the empire. Unfortunately, it was handed over to the Americans, right? No, I'm speaking the truth. So now you have a situation whereby the world is much more multilateral. And then how do we, within this multilateralism, mobilize resources in a more democratic way to be more inclusive? Because the old unilateralism was exclusive. I'm sorry to say this, but that's the fact of life. How else can we explain the greater inequality that we have seen? Right? In the last 75 years, we have seen greater inequality than before. How do you explain this? This was all supposed free markets, everything was supposed to be good, and it ended up being very exclusive, not inclusive. So now we need a very different mindset. It's not about crisis of multilateralism, Jose Antonio. It really is about the crisis of the old world.
Well, that's a good question, but a good way of seeing it. But how do we adapt the multilateral institutions for the new phase, let's say? But there is a perception that, in fact, we are going through a big crisis of the multilateral system. Maybe because of unilateral actions. That's you may be right. Actually, the next panel on trade will probably explore that particular issue. But anyway, Madam President.
Let's agree that there's no crisis of multilateralism. But multilateralism has to change.
Yeah.
Its structures have to change. Its systems has to change. Its partnership arrangement has to change. So we still have to deal with each multilateral institution in accordance with their old procedures, their own organization, their own methods. And unless they can change to do what you want, to be able to reach the poorest of the poor, which is the agenda of the World Bank. But it's not going to happen unless you change the method in which you do this. Yes, we want to see the private sector develop. We all know that's the main engine of growth in our countries today. But we can't get the World Bank to partner with a private company to build a road that will provide the means to have a new factory, a manufacturing company come in. We can't deal with the World Bank to see about our regional institutions to build infrastructure on a regional basis. We have to do it with national negotiations. Those are the things that will have to change. And if we're going to meet the, these challenges of the coming world, of the new world, then how are we going to deliver that scale? Can we see the European Union and the World Bank and the African Development Bank all come together, determining how they can raise the level of resources to a particular country to get them to the place where they can take off and they can sustain themselves on the basis of domestic revenue? It doesn't happen that way. We have to come and negotiate with each institution, meet all their processes that are different, not uniform, and then we find ourselves always, grinding the wheel and not being able to get to that level. So we need to know, how do we meet these changes? Climate change is beginning to, like you say, is beginning to burn us all out.
President Sirleaf,
Yeah.
the old mentality was, when I used to work at the World Bank, let me declare my interest. If you come from emerging market, I come from emerging market. I come from the island of Borneo, as primitive as they came. The idea was that you come to Washington, D.C., and you go to the World Bank or IBRD or ADB, and you say, design an infrastructure project for me. Today, what do? You can't do that anymore. Because they don't design, because they talk about macro with you. What you really now do is you go to a corporation and you say, give me a project, design, build, operate, and transfer. Is that a good solution? It's not. What we need as emerging markets...
But we're designing it ourselves now.
Exactly. That is multilateralism. That is diverse competition of new ideas, bottom up, to change from a unilateral top-down design, right? We can't solve the complex problems of this world with a one-size-fits-all solution. No more. We really need to understand that within the one world, we need to have very diverse competition of ideas and very diverse mobilization of resources. And that's what technology has told us. Look, you can have now internet platforms that can crowdfund any good idea that you have. So it's no longer saying to Bretton Woods institutions, says, you must give me the loan at 8 or whatever it is. No longer, right? You can actually get aid direct from the people across the whole world. The question is, how do you design it? How do you design the technological knowledge distribution platforms to crowdfund the needs of the masses to be more inclusive?
But just, 30 years ago, I started at the bank in '87. And it was very different then. You used to go to countries and you used to come up with your own programs and so on. Now, it's all about what you said, institutional strengthening. And I think the role of the multilateral institutions is to help build the capacity so that the countries themselves have the ability to look at the different designs that come from in front of them and use the bank and the World Bank and other multilateral institutions to actually discuss and agree on what is best for them. And to me, the biggest role for institutions like us is to support, to build capacity, technical capacity in the countries, because otherwise we're not going to get to inclusive development.
Very good. Let's give the floor to you to see if anyone has questions, please. Microphone over there.
Thank you very much. Many years ago, Hernando de Soto's seminal work, The Mystery of Capital, highlighted the fact that 70% of the world lives on untitled land. Estimate $10 trillion worth of capital locked up, inaccessible. Does blockchain technology offer us the opportunity to unlock that $10 trillion and change the world?
Yeah, please, here in the...
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm with Transparency International. Is part of the change that you're suggesting trusting the people more, being less elitist, having your institutions be more accountable? None of you have mentioned governance at all. Secretary Minuchin didn't even mention it. President Sirleaf, you've had experience in dealing with the threats of corruption in government. Perhaps from that experience, you could explain a bit to us how you think the multilateral institutions could assist governments that want to reform and make their own government more transparent and accountable.
Anybody from here, this side? Okay. There are no more questions from the floor, but I will ask another question. I mean, one of the big issues now is the crisis of international migration, blocking the entrance of people from developing countries to developed countries, which, by the way, historically, migration was a major opportunity of development for this country, let's say, the United States, let's say for Canada, for Australia. I mean, all countries that would have not been developed, let's say my region of the world, Argentina, Uruguay, which were major recipients of migrants. Even you can say in the post-war period, and recently, for example, migration of talent has been a major source of technological innovation in this country, among others. Now, so maybe how do we face this issue of international migration? Anyway, anyone wants to answer some of the questions that were raised? Yes, please.
Maybe I can start with, on land, this is a great question because 90% of the poor actually live in rural areas and land is a key constraint. And we have our innovation lab at the bank, which is working on using distributed ledger technology to see if this could allow us to be able to better allocate land, better license land, and so on. So it is promising, but at the end of the day, blockchain DLT is not going to work unless the initial information provided is not correct, right? Why we do have problems with land cadastre at this currently, even without the technology. So I think we need also the reforms, the institutional reforms, to make sure that can go together with the technology to provide the right information. I really appreciate the question on governance and trust, because this is a key issue in the vice presidency that I'm part of. A big part of my group is governance. And this is one of our IDA priorities this year is governance and institutions. And that's what when I think of governance, I think about institutions, strengthening of institutions. Because when you have that, you minimize corruption, you minimize a lot of the issues that we discussed earlier. And there's a lot of work on how do we rebuild trust, which we lost with the global financial crisis. How do we have mechanisms for better domestic resource mobilization so that countries are accountable. So thank you for the question. And for us at the bank, it's a key critical agenda.
Yes, please.
Let me give the experience of Liberia in these two areas. First, land reform. We spent about 2 years trying to come together with a land reform program with the support of the World Bank. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, the main objective was to give ownership of land to the communities, put the communities in charge. But we didn't build capacity in the local government institutions to be able to manage that process to their benefit. So as a result, one had to stop the land reform because putting the land to the community meant giving it to chiefs, which is our historical management system, and the chiefs not having the capacity or the knowledge of how to do it could easily bypass the end objective, which is make sure that the land is negotiated, if necessary, granting benefits to the community themselves. They didn't know how to manage it, and the World Bank was not putting resources in building local capacity to be able to see that that program worked. To come to the question about the corruption in the public service, again, institution is the key. Unless we are going to build a private sector with the institutions that have the means and the capacity to manage the implementation of programs, we will not get the results. When you're dealing with a post-conflict country like my own, where the majority of the public service are people that have come with a culture of disobedience, dishonesty, whatnot, and they don't have the capacity, and we have no means to be able to run the programs you want with a huge public service, carrying a greater resources of domestic revenue. The thing to do, of course, is to have resources to be able to remove all of them, reduce the size of the public service by 50%, put them all in training program with subsidies because there's no private sector, so they know where they can go for alternative employment. Otherwise, you become a social welfare institution providing salaried people who do not have capacity and who do not know how to work. Well, the World Bank will not provide resources for income to those whom one could remove from the public service, because it would be what? Social welfare? What else do we do? And this is why we did not have the institutions to be able to build from the level where people realize, that dishonesty and corruption undermines their own capacity and the capacity of the country to achieve its goals. We didn't have the institutions. And so we end up with carrying the load of government is just one layer of those that have the capacity, who have to do all they can, and then we end up creating a group of technocrats, well paid, with a big difference between them and those who are at the lower levels, who are undercapacitated, underpaid, overworked. Our systems have to change, both internally as well as within the partnership institutions.
Yeah, let me take your question on the migration issue. Why do people want to migrate if they're actually doing pretty well where they are? Answer: climate change, bad governance, failed governance, right? I totally agree with President Sirleaf. Where I come from, the island of Borneo, land was community. Somebody came up with the idea that you should carve this out land for individuals. And the result was you cut down all the trees, you cut down. This is a classic tragedy of the commons. There were no commons. We no longer have commons. And so Bretton Woods institutions really need to rethink whether the old model, the old paradigm, still works for a global world in which we cannot carve out concentrate more and more of the resources for the fewer and fewer. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work, right? And that's why they're migrating. And if they migrate, the political problems cannot be handled in the rich countries, right? It's not just the politics of the movement of population. The incoming countries cannot deal with this migration issue. And that is the biggest challenge of the next 75 years. I put it very bluntly. Now, technology can be a solution, but technology can also be the bane, as we know. So I'm sorry to say that, to answer your question on blockchain, I agree blockchain is a great technology, but who says it's blockchain? Everybody who claims it's blockchain, a lot of it has proven to be crackable. So I think blockchain needs to be more transparent in order to be blockchain.
Climate refugees are estimated by 2050, 143 million.
That's right.
Climate refugees, those that are running away from the disasters.
Okay, let me underscore, I guess, the two major issues that I understand were raised during this roundtable. The first one is the need to rethink multilateralism for a truly multilateral world, and not through a unilateral lens, let's say, of major powers. I think that's a very interesting issue, not only for the Bretton Woods. I mean, having worked for 10 years for the United Nations myself, I think it's also for the United Nations, certainly. And the second issue was institution building at the national level as a major challenge, and also as a major responsibility of international cooperation from the multilateral institutions. And as the Madam President underscored, is also going to the local level. And that's very essential for rural communities in particular, where you don't build institutions that go to the local level, including community institutions, not only state institutions. I think we are in deep trouble. And let me perhaps take also a question of inequality as something that is very important, the question of inequality between countries, the fact that sub-Saharan Africa is still far behind in terms of development, generated major challenges for the world, and also the challenges that, when you mentioned of digital divide, is how technology could also increase certain forces of inequality. So how do we use the new technology in a productive way also to reduce international inequalities? Okay, thank you very much. I'm very glad for this panel, that which was excellent. Thank you.
Jim? Oh, sorry. I'll sit here and you guys will leave the end one empty. Okay. I'm on. Yes, I'm on. Thank you. No, very well done. Well done. Okay. Remember how you dealt with him?
We're going to move right to the next. We're going to move right to the next segment due to time. So please take your seats. Thank you.
Just carry the one section. Okay, I'll just try. All right. Very good choice. All right. Let's make sure we get this. We got a real time crunch here this afternoon, so we're going to really just try and get started right on time and finish on time. Welcome to this third session here. I'm Jim Colby, co-chair of the Bretton Woods Committee, and I feel it's a real treat to be on this platform with two people that I have such great respect for and have worked with for so long, Ambassador Carla Hills, with NAFTA as our USTR, and the Inter-American, so many different things that we've worked on together. And Jim Bacchus, who I served with in Congress and has, of course, been a real champion on trade issues. So we're going to get right into it. To borrow a phrase from Charles Dickens, it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. It's certainly the best of times in that there's more going on trade around the world and in this country than I think we've seen in a long, long time. I mean, trade is on the front pages of of everything seems almost every single day. It's the worst of times in that we seem to see the fraying and the shredding of some of the bilateral agreements that we've had, and also the failure of some of the multilateral institutions. So we have a lot going on right now on the area of trade. So I'm going to start with this general question and include it in a specific one that I would like you both to address. How do you see the future, the agenda going forward in the next few years, couple of years on trade? We have with USMCA, with China, with Brexit, with Europe. The specific question that I want to ask is Congress going to get the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 done or not? Or are we going to see it enacted? So trade in general and specifically about USMCA. Carla, let's start with you.
Did you bring a crystal ball?
No, but you did, so I know you're going to give the answer.
I think that you say the best of times and the worst of times. I think this is the most uncertain of times that I've ever experienced. On the U.S. agenda for trade, we have not only the agreement with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA, that is going to have real challenges. I will be surprised if it is approved 2019, but I hope it is. We have the negotiations with a range of others, including China. Our objections or our objectives with China, many of them are quite legitimate. I do not applaud the fact that we didn't join hands with nations around the world that are experiencing the same problems that we experience and work with China, which actually it would be a win-win for them, because as their economy slows down, as they are funneling credit to state-owned enterprises that are not performing and starving private sector that is producing jobs, GDP, productivity, it would make a difference. So we kind of like playing tennis and brought the wrong racket. And then we have, I just read this morning that Japan is sending their economic minister, and we will start those negotiations that were noticed to our Congress in October on the 16th through the 17th of April. But then we also have the negotiations that we have noticed to our Congress with Europe. And I think that the latter two, Japan and Europe, are going to be an uphill run. But none of the others that I've mentioned are going to be a downhill breeze. So be ready for a couple of years of real trauma. And the problem is that the rhetoric that surrounds them and some of the actions we take have an adverse effect on our multilateral institutions. Jim knows more about that than anyone. And perhaps I should stop there since our time is limited. I could go on and on.
We all could. Jim, the trade agenda going forward in USMCA. Carla, you said you'd be surprised it was in 2019. You think it's even possible in 2020, an election year, to pass it. So yeah. I'll pass that question on to Jim here, USMCA, if it doesn't get done this year. But then the general question.
Well, the political conventional wisdom would say that if we don't pass it this year, we won't pass it next year. And I think I agree with that conventional wisdom. We were all three much involved in passing the NAFTA, and we're all supporters of it. I'm not particularly impressed with the revisions that President Trump has negotiated in the NAFTA, nor did I support the way in which he bullied our trading partners into those revisions. That said, I would vote for it if it came up, because it would be certainly better than not having a NAFTA, which is perhaps one of the possibilities. It does disturb me, though, that we're moving away from freer trade in the NAFTA toward more managed trade. And I think that's a move in the wrong direction. it's typical, in my view, of what I see as the fault at the bottom of the Trump trade policy. It's not a policy in favor of free trade, despite what the Secretary told us earlier today. It's a policy in favor of managed trade. And I don't think managed trade works. It won't work for us. It's not going to work over a longer period of time for China or for anyone else. But I'm not sure this is being debated. Even the very finest journalists we have tend to follow the blow-by-blow rather than looking at the bigger picture. There are some exceptions. Some of them are here today. But I'm afraid that we're drifting toward a policy in which we want to dictate economic outcomes in the marketplace. And the principal difference between the two parties that we have in the United States is that they just want to dictate the outcomes in different ways. So I find myself agreeing, sadly, with Carla on the politics. I don't think she's happy with her prediction herself, but there's where we are.
Are we moving away from multilateralism? I mean, this goes back really before this current administration. We saw the faltering of the multilateral rounds, the Uruguay round, the first rounds since GATT was created that failed, it wasn't able to succeed. Are we moving steadily away from any kind of multilateral to you said managed trade, but to bilateral agreements? You think that's the future where we're going to see? We're not going to see multilateral agreements?
We have seen a great multiplicity of bilateral agreements around the world, and it is harder to bring more people to the table, but you also get more back. When you put something on the table that Jim wants, I don't have to pay for it. And when he puts something on the table you want, I get two things. So you really get a better agreement with more. I'm a fervent multilateralist. I think that that is the best outcome. But I do believe that a great plurilateral agreement can be a model for multilateral improvement. And I say that because you mentioned the Uruguay round, and it cratered in Europe in about 1990. And we began the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement in June of '91, finished it in August of '92. President Bush Sr. signed it in December of '92, and President Clinton got it through our Congress in '93, and it took force in January 1 of '94. And within 4 months, all then 126 trade ministers came back to the table and borrowed from the North American Free Trade Agreement the protections for intellectual property, the protections for investment, the dispute settlement mechanism, the services sector. And we had never had those before. That upgraded the GATT and created the WTO, copy of the dispute settlement mechanism. So I do think that a sterling plurilateral agreement can serve an outstanding purpose in the multilateral circumstance in some instances.
But
Yes, I agree with Carla. Let me be a bit more philosophical. I was the Val Forum 2 weeks ago speaking, and one of the questions that was posed there was a similar question. Is multilateralism outdated? And I don't think that's the right question. If you talk to ancient historians, if you talk to anthropologists, if you talk to evolutionary biologists, they will tell you that the reason why our species so far has succeeded is because we have been uniquely able among all species to combine imagination and cooperation. I don't think the question about multilateralism, which is simply a word we use for global cooperation, is whether it's outdated. I think the question is whether as a species we are able yet fully to engage in multilateralism. I have always hoped, and I know the two of you have as well, that the multilateralism, the global cooperation we've had in trade, could lead to even more cooperation in trade, but also more global cooperation in other areas of global concern, principally now climate change. And I think the real question is whether we're ready for it. And given climate change, we have to be ready for it. That's the real question we're facing. And at a time when even what we've done multilaterally so far is in jeopardy, and make no mistake about it, it is. It's under attack in many places, but certainly from Washington, D.C. We need to reaffirm our commitment to global cooperation and get serious about it, and soon.
Okay, let's turn to something that's bilateral agreement between China. We heard Secretary Minuchin earlier today say that they were making progress, but he was understandably very circumspect about any of the details of that. It seems like one of the key issues has been the enforcement. How do we make sure we get enforcement? I'd like each of you to maybe just tell me what you think, what would constitute a really good agreement with China. Do you think it's doable? Is it possible to happen? We'll start with Jim at that end this time.
Well, it depends on what the goals of the administration are. If the goal is to reduce the bilateral goods deficit with China, then that's a silly goal. It makes no economic sense. I don't think we have to explain that here to this audience. Perhaps we need to explain it in the White House. If the goal is to address the structural issues that rightly concern us in the way that China is taking statist approaches, mercantilist approaches, approaches that involve managed trade, then that's the right target. And that's the kind of agreement we should be seeking. If the goal is simply to cut a deal, to look at it transactionally and get some guaranteed slices of the Chinese market in some important sectors of trade, well, that too is managed trade. We don't know what's in this deal yet. 2 points here, and let me make a confession. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a former international judge for the WTO, and I have a bit of a bias in favor of the international rule of law. So take that into account. All the focus here is on this deal between the United States and China bilaterally. But if in this deal, say it's a transactional deal, the Chinese decide that, okay, we'll guarantee that we'll give the U.S. 10% of our market in X product next year. Well, what about the rights of other WTO members who also produce X product? This is a fundamental violation of the most favored nation obligation of non-discrimination. That's the heart of the world trading system, an obligation which we supposedly believe. Do we care about that anymore? And in terms of enforcement, I don't know what's in this draft agreement. Enforcement would be a key to it. But what are we talking about using as a tool of enforcement? The tariffs that the United States has imposed are illegal under international law, period. We're not even claiming a national security defense for these tariffs, and that's a dubious pretext in other places, but that's not even claimed here. Section 301, to the extent that it is illegal under WTO law, is only legal if we use it as we promised we would, exclusively through WTO dispute settlement. Instead, the self-proclaimed tariff man we have as president, decided he would take another approach, circumvent the rule of law, and engage in the exercise of leverage by imposing these unilateral tariffs. Well, if we maintain these tariffs in place, they're still illegal. If we reduce part of them and agree to restore them, if the Chinese don't do exactly as we wish, that's still illegal under international law. If the Chinese want to relinquish their WTO rights to us because of our pressure that they should do so, they have that right, in my view, but why would they do that? Why would they do that? I want to see President Xi explain doing that to the Chinese people in a country that suffered from all those unequal treaties imposed on them in the 19th century. So I'm not sure what we're going to get. I do know this: whatever we get, President Trump will say it's the best deal we've ever gotten, and he will declare victory and move on. But unless we address these fundamental structural problems, technology transfer and IP violations and industrial subsidies and agricultural subsidies and notifications for all of them, and all these investment performance requirements in a way that's compatible with WTO rules, then we're not going to have a deal that will work, and we'll end up back in the WTO. And I agree with Carla. We should, at the outset, have gone in with our like-minded trading partners and brought these concerns to the WTO as we're required by treaty law to do so.
Carla, comments on the China agreement, or where it may go, or what we may end up with?
I don't disagree with Jim. I think that where we are is that we've certainly captured China's attention. I would not have recommended the manner in which we have done so, but the Congress in China at the beginning of March has passed the foreign investment law. There's a little bit of ambiguity in some of the provisions, but it is a small step forward. They have strengthened the intellectual property rules, which is something that we have been vigorously wanting, and several other measures where they have actually moved in the right direction. I think that I would say that many of the things that we are complaining about need to be fixed in the World Trade Organization. And that is, we don't have rules to deal with state-owned enterprises that are not acting in a market fashion. And so, in fact, we have rules in the WTO that require giving notice when you give a subsidy. And that has been just flaunted. Nobody does that. On designation, am I a underdeveloped country? That is, I get to decide that on my own. And 1/3 of the WTO members have determined that they are developing countries. This doesn't make any sense. In fact, 10 of the 20, G20, have declared that they are developing countries. So we have to get a system that reflects the facts and has enforcement mechanisms. And if the WTO were to pick up on 3 areas that I think it's deficient, one is monitoring what is already agreed to. It doesn't do that. And so half the G20 can just declare whatever they want. It's self-declaratory. That they have to enforce the rules, and the enforcement mechanism is difficult because we don't have rules for the 21st century in many areas, and particularly in intellectual property. What do we do about it? And so those 2 areas of monitoring and enforcement. The third is negotiation. One of the basic precepts of creating the WTO is the ongoing negotiations. And so that would keep it up to date, and also we could bring in the issues that we had. good news. You know, you started out by saying we have good news and less good news. The good news is that we have Europe, Japan, and the United States trying to work together on kind of an outline of reforms for the WTO that would address some of the concerns. We have Canada that has created a group of, I think, 13, which is trying to address the reforms that are critically needed for the WTO. If these groups would gather together, you almost certainly would have a majority because, and although the WTO is a consensus organization, you need 100%. The fact is that when you are representing like 90% of world GDP, people tend to listen to you. And so I think that there is a path through the thicket, but what we're missing is leadership.
Well, we keep coming back to the WTO, and so I'm going to just shift to that for a second here, because its role. Obviously, Jim, this is something you have a great interest in. We're going to be down to one appellate judge by the end of the year. It'll basically cease to function. Is there any hope that we're going to get the appellate system up and running, or is there, as I keep hearing from some people, it's a time to look at a complete reform of the WTO, as perhaps Carl was just suggesting?
Well, I think it needs to be noted that of the 164 members of the WTO, there is only one that is of the view that the appellate body of the WTO has not been doing its job. I know it's conventional wisdom here in Washington, in the media, in both parties. It's in the talking points that the 7 members of the appellate body, as they're supposed to be, we're now down to 3, have routinely overreached. They've routinely added to the obligations in the treaties. They've routinely made things up. I think that's a direct quote from the president. It's certainly a paraphrase. And that the United States has lost almost all the cases that it has brought in the WTO as a consequence. None of this is true. There's not another member of the WTO that feels the appellate body has acted in this way. No one claims perfection for the appellate body. I certainly don't, and I was on it. Any human institution is going to fall short of perfection. But it is a fact also that at last count, the United States had won 86% of the cases it brought to the WTO in the first 24 years of its existence. Now, it's lost a lot of cases in recent years, but this is simply because, I don't want to shock you, the United States routinely refuses to comply with its WTO obligations on trade remedies because it wants to have all the latitude that it wishes to have to be as protectionist as it wants to be, to rig the rules in its own way. And the Trump administration is populated by a lot of protectionist trade lawyers, including my friend Bob Lighthizer, a very highly skilled lawyer, a good guy, but a protectionist, who don't like a system in which there's a rule of law. They prefer the rule of power, and they prefer a system in which the WTO judges will just simply do as the United States wants them to do. And the WTO judges have sworn that they will be independent and impartial. They're required not once but in 2 places in the WTO treaty to be independent and impartial, so they can't be intimidated by anyone, the United States or any other country, and they've refused to be intimidated. So now we have this deadlock in which the United States simply refuses to join the consensus to appoint any more judges, and come the end of the year, as you said, Jim, we'll be down to 1 judge, and then the appellate body won't be able to hear any appeals. We'll have 1 brilliant Chinese judge who will have nothing to do.
So, Jim, I'm kind of getting the impression here today that you may have some disagreements with the current administration about trade. You're not in negotiation with them to become the chief trade advisor to the president, or are you? No, the White House, that's all right, never mind.
Well, there have been several countries that independently have suggested that they would like to nominate me to return to the appellate body
Well, we think you should.
for the sole purpose of getting the United States
To behave.
and submit a reasonable nominee from the United States.
All right, well,
otherwise, they'd be stuck with me again.
Carly, any other thoughts? You spoke a few moments ago about the WTO, but any other thoughts in particular about this appellate issue? And going forward, is the WTO going to have a role to play?
We need the WTO. It was a great addition to our international trade rules. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, had a system for disputes, but not dispute settlement. And the WTO has done a fabulous job. And as Jim said, the United States has won most of the cases it's initiated. It's also lost most of the cases that were brought against it. But that is true for every single member of the WTO, which shouldn't be surprising.
We've lost a lower percentage than other countries.
That is correct. But it shouldn't be surprising, because if I think you've done something wrong, probably the likelihood is that there's some error there. And so we need to bring it back. As I said, I do think that it can be improved in the dispute settlement in terms of clarity of a term and that sort of thing. But it's going to take like-minded nations, governments, to agree to this. And it takes you back to the beginning of the Bretton Woods organizations, when 23 like-minded nations after World War II said no more of this. We are going to create the economic organizations, the political organizations that maintain stability and encourage prosperity. And we've been blessed for 70 years with the organizations that range from the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, and so forth, the WTO now. And we need to maintain and upgrade them. The WTO is 25 years old. There are things that could be changed. The one worry is that it requires a consensus of the 164. That's tough. Hard to get an agreement in this room on a single issue. Somebody's going to step aside. But I do think that if a majority of the nation's GDP, if we could assemble 90% of the world's GDP and set separate rules, even if we were to go into a related plurilateral agreement, which we have done, we have a half a dozen plurilateral agreements that are invitations to all others not part of it to join, and they have been successful.
We're going to run out of time, but we're going to stay in that continent, that part of the world where Geneva is, and this last one you can give me a very quick answer if you want there. When Big Ben strikes midnight on Friday, is the UK going to be in or out of the EU?
Let me look at the crystal ball. What's your best guess, Jim?
My best guess is out.
Out? Hard out on Friday.
You don't think the EU will give it an extension of time?
Well, I hope they will, but there are increasing pressures within Europe not to allow
Macron, for one.
an extension of time. The Europeans are pretty much fed up with the British, and the British seem bent on economic suicide. And it's a shame. I'm the biggest Anglophile you could ever find, and I'm much distressed by it personally. Of course, they have to make their own decisions. We have enough challenges in our own country now with our government that we shouldn't be criticizing others. But I think the likelihood is that at best it's going to delay the inevitable, because there's as bad as the deal Prime Minister May negotiated was and is, it's probably the best deal they're going to get.
So, Carla, is there going to be an extension, and will it be short term or long term? What do you think?
I would argue to the European Union there should be an extension. If you have Great Britain step aside and go out, what is that going to signal to Hungary, Poland, Italy? Is that going to be the beginning of a disintegration of a fantastic coalition that again came together after our horrible, horrible experience with war? And so let's be patient. Europe is no worse off by giving an extension than to have Europe on the outside and they're debating over rules. And one of the complaints is bureaucracy. And I think it would be a contagious kind of a situation. And you might just have others say, me too. Not a good statement.
I share that fear, but I also fear the British are running out of time.
Yes.
And they pushed it about as far as they can push it with the continent.
Well, I might argue, in answer to Carlos, that other countries, seeing what's been going on with Britain and the fiasco there, might want to think twice about whether they proceed out of the European Union, whether they jump out themselves. This has been a great discussion. I wish we had time for questions here, but we are very compacted on our time with this panel. So I want to thank our panelists for being up here, and I want to thank the audience for being part of it.
You did a great job. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
I got my stuff over on that side there. Thank you, Carla, very much.
It matters in theory.
Okay, yes, you're there, and then you have yes, you're there, and then Axel, and then Kurt. They've managed to get a suitably diverse panel.
Okay, take a breath. Last segment. We're going to get started. Thank you.
Oh, really? Oh, that's news. Okay.
No, I think they're still having dinner. Okay, everyone, I would ask you all to take your seats. Is this microphone working? Is the microphone working? Yes, great, okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, we just had a fascinating afternoon of conversation, and this is the last panel, the highlight, with three luminaries from the financial world who need no introduction. Claire Woodman at the end from Morgan Stanley, Axel Weber, now at UBS, formerly Bundesbank, and Mark Carney from the Bank of England. And we're here today to talk about the future of financial cooperation, future financial architecture. We're here to celebrate a 75th birthday. And frankly, under many measures, it's quite an unhappy birthday because although the IMF and World Bank are still performing the functions with great enthusiasm, although we do have institutions like the Financial Stability Board and other institutions for financial cooperation, we're living in a world which is increasingly protectionist. We're living in a world of increasing unilateral action. I'm not going to mention Brexit yet, but we've just heard from Secretary Minuchin about all the things he's doing in terms of the US-China trade talks, including a currency agreement, which is hardly a display of multilateralism. And we're living in a time when really the populations are questioning what these institutions and this collaboration is for. The financial community responded with tremendous cooperation to the financial crisis. There was good reactive collaboration, but whether there's been good proactive collaboration is a big question. So, Mark.
Okay.
I'm being British and very informal. Sorry, Governor Carney, to be American.
Actually, it works it's the other way around, actually. Yeah.
Well,
but
is multilateralism dead?
no, it's not dead. And thanks for your admirable restraint on Brexit. We'll see how long that lasts. But
I should say about 7 minutes.
About 7 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't I do this, which is just say a few words about how the FSB has worked, because I think it has worked. And then maybe flag a couple of issues that are on, coming issues that might challenge the model, but equally are suited to the model. So let's just take it as, if we can. I mean, people will have issues with various individual reforms, but let's just take it as a lot has been done, has been agreed that has made the system stronger, safer, and fairer. More can be done. That not everything's perfect. It doesn't all work, but there has been a process that has developed a fairly coherent and comprehensive set of reforms. So why was why was that the case? Now, it wasn't done. These agreements were not made in a treaty-based organization, so it's outside of the formal Bretton Woods structure. It had the advantage, admittedly, it had the advantage up front of having a crisis, which is always a good catalyst, and a reasonably quick diagnosis of some of the underlying causes of that crisis, not the deep economic causes, but in the financial sector. So there were issues to address. It also had the advantage right up front of having a very clear mandate from G20 leaders, and through the G20 summit cycle, a way to catalyze action and to assess progress. The next advantage the FSB has had is it's had the right people around the table. And by that I mean it's not just, and I used to be one of these people, it's not just international Sherpas who go to IMF meetings and G20 meetings and various other meetings of the Bretton Woods Committee. Glad to be here. But that's basically what they do, is they fly around the world and go to meetings as opposed to also do a day job. And it's quite,
like Claire. Claire does a day job.
Claire does a day job. You do a day job. Actually, I'm looking across this room. All of you do day jobs. But there are another group of people who aren't in this room who are just flying around. But the point being, so if you bring the bank regulator from one of the G20 countries to a discussion about how we should develop a resolution framework for banks, he or she knows that they're going to have to go back and implement this. They know a lot about how banks actually work. They know about their home regulatory structure. It is not about assembling a series of words. It's about actually solving a problem. And so you get the right people in the room, the regulators, central banks, the finance ministries for the political backing, the international standard setters, and you have a process which actually, and this is the key, you have to listen to the people in the room, and it can be messy and you have to develop a consensus over time. But if I can give very quickly a couple examples, on Too Big to Fail, the actual structure of that was ultimately heavily influenced by China because of some of the ideas that came out. The design of the international liquidity standards by Mexico, because they saw certain aspects in terms of foreign banks operating in Mexico. So again, you get a better process. And that process creates a sense of ownership. And since it's the people who actually run the organizations back home, when they go home to implement, now there's always going to be some tailoring, and you have to accept that there'll be some tailoring of these reforms. By and large, they're implemented.
Right.
If they're not, it's assessed and looked at. So I just wanted to, why it worked. It's not treaty-based. You have a process that gets there. Now the challenge, the challenge on a go-forward basis is there's less immediate consensus on what the issues are, because you're not fighting a crisis, you're addressing counterfactuals, risks that could come, whether it's around asset management, issues around transition to a low-carbon economy. And then I'll finish with this, because I can see you want to move on. But to Brexit,
Not yet.
so actually, I'm going to stretch this out. On a series of issues around, let's call it operational risk.
Yeah.
So one of the big, there's a bunch of people from the private sector, private financial sector here. Claire would know this, live this. A shift of activities to the cloud. Okay, that is a fundamental cross-border issue. It has an issue in terms of standards, supervisory cooperation, understanding those issues. This is a coming issue that we need to address.
Yeah.
Cyber is fundamentally cross-border and requires heavy elements of cooperation. Those issues also require the financial sector and financial regulators to talk to other regulators, because they're common issues. Unlike much of what's in finance that was dealt with after the crisis, these are issues that cut across a huge range of industries.
Yeah.
Now, the cloud, in cyber, the financial sector is attacked much more than any other sector in the economy. The systemic consequences are arguably greater. But the solution on cyber is a broader solution. So those aspects bring new challenges. I do think this sort of architecture will continue to be relevant, and that what's crucial, and I'll finish on this, is, and I think there is real progress on this, particularly with the fund, is integrating that with the Bretton Woods, the historic Bretton Woods institutions. So when you think about implementation of FSB reforms, and potential adjustment of those reforms when they're not working perfectly together, when they're not working perfectly together. The fund's FSAP review programs are critical. And then the last thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, because Tharman is here, and this is one part of a great set of work that he did on the future of the system, but how surveillance is conducted and how joined up surveillance is between the authorities on the ground, the fund, and I think the FSB-IMF nexus is crucial for that.
Absolutely.
Stop there.
Axel, would you agree? I mean, Marcus just argued that essentially, the FSB has been one example of collaboration working, but that was because they had the right people and they were responding to a crisis.
Yes,
what about the next phase?
I don't have that much different view. If you look at the Bretton Woods organizations, really, when we hit the financial crisis, it was a global crisis. You needed coordination at the center. And of course, at the center of that crisis coordination mechanism was not just the various central banks and financial institutions, it was also the IMF. Best thing that can happen to you, an experienced 65-year-old institution that knows it all, is at the helm of crisis management. And I think in the post-crisis resolution area, it also played an important role. But we've moved on. Being a Swiss bank, we know how important, in addition to Bretton Woods organizations based in Washington, D.C., Basel-based organizations are. Whether it's the FSB, whether it's the Basel Committee, whether it's the IOSCO, there is a lot of work in terms of re-regulating the system and making the transition from crisis management to post-crisis stability-enhancing collaboration that was much more based on collaboration of informal bodies. Actually, the elevation of the FSB was one such coordinated move, and I think it worked well. If I look at what is the day-to-day for us as a banking industry, I would say largely when it comes to capital, when it comes to liquidity, when it comes to resolvability, we're seeing the end of the tunnel there because that work is largely done. Over the last 10 years, we've massively improved the resilience of the financial institutions we're in charge of. Have we improved it in every area? No, it's capital, liquidity, resolvability. But if you look at operations, and Mark mentioned that, operational risks, there is a whole new area of collaboration that we need to work. And when I look at who do we work with here, I also have the privilege of sharing the IAF, which is the Global Industry Organization, also a Washington-based institution. But when we talk about cyber resilience, about AML, KYC, about financial crime, we actually talk to Europol, we talk to international law enforcement agencies, and the entire sector that is around that. So it's law enforcement, it is organizations like Europol or Interpol, it is actually Homeland Security and many of the cyber defense institutions that are being built. Naturally, we don't have those. In Switzerland, we had to build a cyber resilience center and a cyber resilience organization that didn't exist before. So when it comes to stability in the financial sector, given that we are a digital industry, given that digitalization is changing the way the industry works, given the interconnection between client is moving on to platforms, given that we have problems in making sure that financial stability is also there in terms of operational resilience, we work with different players and need to work with different players to get that going. So that's one part where I think the whole infrastructure is moving from Basel-based organizations and Washington-based organizations to organizations that have a much less established way of collaborating. And actually, it's very hard to get all these law enforcement agencies around the table because exchange of information, the ability of us to exchange information with non-domestic law enforcement agencies is very limited, and we need the coordination by those organizations. Big work that is ahead of us, but we need to get it done because cyber resilience and operational resilience is key for making sure in a digitalized financial world we have clients be able to address their needs for transactions at each and every state of the world. Move one step beyond, and I'm finishing on that. Look at the future of banking. The future of banking is going to be about new assets, about new investments. And let me just mention two areas where we're very active. One is sustainable investments, a whole new asset class. At the moment, there is no clear rules around that. We work with the United Nations and other organizations to really establish standards so that we can prevent that there is mis-selling under that label from the start. Because that industry needs to have a credible start. If it is misused and if there is mis-selling, if there's greenwashing, it will not get the traction it needs. One element of that, impact investing. Again, we're working with organizations like the IFC, and we launch a set of principles for industry principles, voluntary agreements about some of these impact investment universe and how that can develop. So as you're looking at how the financial world is developing, we're moving more and more from Washington and Basel-based organizations to collaborations that don't have constituency, but where you need the collaboration of institutions in an evolving space. And my view is a bit, look, the first organization that is up there and gets on top of an issue, they're out there to organize that in the future. And that, for example, if you look at the United Nations attempt with the Sustainable Development Goals, at the moment, the entire workflow of that is under that heading. And there'll be more organizations developing as we move from planning and understanding the problem to implementing and getting it done. Implementation needs different collaboration than actually the drawing of a bid plan and raising awareness. We're at the stage, let's sit down and get it done. And getting it done requires collaboration with other organizations. Doesn't mean you don't need to work anymore with the Basel or Washington-based institutions. That's a given. You need to continue to do that. But there'll be other players in that game that we need to bring onto the same level of international collaboration. The worst thing you would get, and this would be my last point, the worst thing you get is fragmentation, and we start from not level playing field in any of these areas. We should learn the lesson from the crisis that basically the best thing on these global topics is to start at the global level with a global reach and a global level playing field, because then we avoid having to deal with problems of arbitrage, this problem of regulatory differentials, because that's usually a recipe for disaster. But we're not there.
So we're basically dealing with quite a fundamental shift in the tribes, or new tribes. I mean, Claire, when you look at the regulatory architecture, when you look at the mechanisms for coordination, do you feel confident that they are sufficiently cohesive and clear-cut, or are you drowning in competing tribal groups and structures?
Well, obviously, being in a regulated industry and having, a number of regulators and a primary regulator to satisfy and work with, obviously there's always going to be nuance in the requirements and the expectations. But this morning we had a large session roundtable at the CFTC to talk about benchmark reform. And that's one initiative that in the last year, I think we have made more progress working through a combination of public and private sector together. that I don't think anyone would have expected. Now, that's not to say that between now and 2021 there is considerable work to do to implement alternative reference rates and get those fully implemented
the new
and
LIBOR,
used. The new LIBOR, correct. But there's a real live example of where, you know, new structures and new constituencies are working well together to reform and improve the marketplace. I would say, just to add to Axel and Mark's comments, technology absolutely is changing the way that we do business. The wholesale markets are, you know, pretty much fully electronified. And so, of course, the top risk that every management team, board, and regulator and central bank worries about is cyber risk. We ourselves at Morgan Stanley, probably about 5 years ago, were spending something like less than $100 million on cyber risk. This year, I suspect we'll spend, you know, somewhere around $400 million on cyber. And to talk about collective solutions, that's one area where each firm can build up its responses and its protective defences to protect its perimeter, but we absolutely need to take forward and make sure that there are collaborative and collective efforts to ensure that the industry is protected. So some of the work, for example, that the Governor was referring to in terms of operational resiliency is a key priority for us in the coming year. And we absolutely welcome what the FSB and the Bank of England have been promoting. I think the other thing that I think Axel sort of touched on, that I think the financial architecture really needs to focus on, is if we look at markets, they are evolving in structure in terms of electronification, but the nature of markets are also changing. And what we have seen in the last few years is the expansion and growth of private markets as a really meaningful place for small and large companies to find financing and for investors to find alternative sources of yield. And so I think that as the architecture looks forward, certainly regulators and policymakers will be thinking about, have they made the right conclusions about whether private markets might be potentially a source of future financial instability or not. Climate change obviously is a key priority, and the role that finance plays not only to combat climate change but also to provide sustainable investing opportunities is key. And like UBS, we have been heavily involved in raising finance for green and sustainable bonds, and have a very key goal to make sure that we finance 250 billion of low carbon initiatives by 2030.
Wow.
But last and not least, one of the lessons from the crisis that is continuing and we need to be focused on, and it's been a key part of the way that we have repositioned our business and our model, is the continued focus on culture and conduct. And earlier on in the sessions today, one of the audience, I think from Transparency International, raised governance, and I think corporate governance is absolutely front and foremost at people's minds in terms of continuity of issues to focus on.
Thank you. Can I ask one question, which is somewhat the elephant in the room, which is that, you know, Bretton Woods was created at a time when there were essentially the victors from World War II were in charge. We now have a world where China is increasingly powerful, and yet if you look at the IMF's Global Financial Stability Report, which I just read a few hours ago, you know, the part of the chart in terms of financial risk that's flashing red is China. And also the non-banking sector to a degree, to pick up on Claire's point. How easy is it going to be in the coming years to actually ensure that China is a meaningful and active part of any system of global collaboration?
Well,
I mean, you know, how do you say Bretton Woods in Chinese?
Well, first off, China is absolutely central to every collaborative mechanism. I mean, front and center in the G20 at the Bretton Woods institutions themselves. I gave an example of some of the key reforms, but it's true virtually every reform. China is an extremely active participant in the FSB, and I would go further to say that actually some elements of the approach that they're taking to address issues in shadow banking sector, have been informed by FSB reviews and conversations and engagement with partners.
They read your reports.
No, much more than that. Don't be glib about it. This is,
I'm sorry.
you asked a serious question.
Yeah.
They are fully engaged in these issues, and these are serious issues, but they are the product in part of success. I mean, it is very hard to emerge without having some form. I mean, when you go through a rapid period of financial deepening, it's very easy to get off track on that. You have to be very nimble, and I think what we're seeing is the Chinese are taking the lessons that globally, and they're taking best practice and starting to apply it. Now, they have an issue. They'll fully admit that they have an issue. They know that. And it's one of the reasons why that economy is slowed. But I would say that their chances of success are greatly enhanced by the fact that they are fully engaged members of the system.
Right. Claire and Axel, I'd like to ask you, I mean, either feel free to comment on China if you like, but I'm also curious, when you look at where the world is today in terms of financial stability, how confident are you that we are in a much better place than before?
I think one aspect that Claire has already alluded to is I think we have made the core of the financial system, deposit-taking institutions, pretty much safer than they were. I'm much less worried about that core part of the financial system, as most of the regulators will also tell you. But what we're not sure is whether market-based finance, and if the next crisis is not like the last crisis, whether we have sufficient provisions for stability and liquidity provision in a crisis in that part of the system. And I think it is largely limited by factors like central bank refinancing access is there for banks. It's not there for a broader set of players. And in the last financial crisis, they weren't the core of the problem. But I can tell you in Europe, access of funds in the market to central bank liquidity was done by opening emergency windows in three-party repos where, thankfully enough, most of them had a parent that was a bank, and so they could get collateral lending through the bank to the market-based institution, so they didn't have to close and sell down assets. It's not sure, since that parent model has disappeared by and large, whether market-based finance will have the same access to liquidity. And actually, what banks are doing is we're not engaging in market making anymore to the same degree as in the past. We're basically having liquidity buffers that, in case there is a crisis, we rely on our emergency liquidity and we stop lending. And so market players have to access liquidity through other forms and means. And of course, they will turn to the central banks and they will tell you it's not within our framework. So I think we have to put some provisions
within our framework.
It's in with your framework.
It's in the Bank of England.
You're an absolute exception, a very laudable exception. And when we talk about many other central banks, really feel that constructive ambiguity around that issue rather than constructive clarity is a way to go. I think that's not true. And the second point that I would like to make is look at the way collaboration has evolved. If you start Bretton Woods organizations, I've been a governor on the fund for Germany for a while. We have failed to open up fast enough to the emergence of China. We've not involved China and given them enough seat and voice around the table as fast enough as it might have been necessary. If you look at the development area, they started their own model with their own organizations, and they're looking at the Asian Pacific region as a sphere of influence, and they're using their financial resources in that area to gain access and to basically have good collaboration and to provide financing. The reaction to that has to be that we have to bring them back into the Washington-based organizations. We need to work together. Not doing that would be very, very difficult, because if they go off in one direction and we go off another, doesn't make for a stable future. So I think even in areas where we've been slow, and because we were slow, because the financial crisis hit. Everyone was looking at their financial system. We had other things to do than really to open up and change the architecture at the same time where we were relying on the architecture to play a key role in crisis management. And China admittedly wasn't hit hard by the financial crisis, but in the post-crisis world, we haven't opened up enough. And I think now what you're seeing, and that gets me somewhat concerned, is a bipolar world emerging. Discussions between the United States and China on currency arrangements, on the opening up of financial markets, on liberalization of the capital accounts. That has become a very bilateral discussion among the two major currencies in the world, that is the renminbi and the US. And we somehow have to bring that back into the negotiating framework of the multilateral organizations, else we have bilateralism and a web of bilateral arrangements evolve, which in my view is in nobody's interest.
But in practical terms, that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I must say, when I look at what's happening right now in terms of the fragmentation of the system, I'm wondering, is there going to actually be a Bretton Woods institutional framework in 75 years' time or 7 years' time?
There should be. But, I agree with you that there are challenges, but we need to rise to those challenges. What is very important is that these international organizations have played a key role and can continue to play a key role, but they need to adapt. If they don't adapt fast enough, new organizations will basically emerge on the perimeters. And so it's not a given that they will not keep the relevance they had over 75 years. But in order to play that role in the future, you need much stronger adaptation to the new challenges, and you need everyone to look to the IMF and the World Bank for resolution rather than looking somewhere else to solve these problems. And I think it is important that the heads of these organizations understand it and act on that. And I think they do. It's just very hard, once these discussions have started, to bring everyone back to the table.
Right.
If
Mark,
we
and
can
then Claire.
make a point, just picking up on where Axel left off, which is that, so over the course of the next few decades, and it's hard to predict with certainty how this adjustment goes, but there's going to be a gradual reordering of the reserve currency system, the actual reserve currency, not talking about nominal shares of an SDR. During that period of time, the fundamental asymmetry that exists in the international monetary and financial system is only going to grow, by which I mean that the weight of the emerging world, including China, will continue to increase, but the dominance of the dollar in trade invoicing, in financial flows, in financial assets will remain disproportionate relative to, there's huge incumbency value and we know this from the UK's own experience a century ago. And in that world, and in a world of relatively free capital flows, a lot of attention has to be paid to the underlying financial architecture. It starts partly with the underlying safety nets, but issues such as Axel alluded to on let's say, the asset management complex, how that grows, this potential flows, the issues Claire brought up in terms of electronification of markets, the way that cross-border retail payments and corporate payments are made as fintech spreads out. All of those have to be managed in a way that takes into account, in a way that is increases the quantum of sustainable capital flows, or to put it in IMF speak, reduces the capital flows at risk in the system, because there'll be a lot of pressure from the center. And just to, I'll finish with just one basic point, which this room kind of knows, but it bears repeating, which is, the last time the Fed raised interest rates, the emerging world was about a little more than 40% of the global economy. Now it's 60% of the global economy. The spillover, spillback is bigger. And last time, in the intervening period between those two rate cycles, all the net flows to emerging economies have been through market-based finance, not through the banking system. That's a different world, both in the real economy and also in the structure of finance. And that's why, I'm not answering your question in terms of who's going to do it, but between a combination of the private sector, but very importantly, I think the FSB and the IMF, that it needs to work together, and obviously with the big players themselves. But these issues are too global to be solved on a bilateral basis.
But for a bank like Morgan Stanley, I mean, you must be confronting a future that's so uncertain that in a sense you have to build in a lot of optionality into your structure in terms of how you actually run your business.
Well, we had multiple scenarios for Brexit, but probably not the one that we're currently facing this week.
I am going to ask Mark about Brexit in a moment, but do tell us about your scenarios on Brexit. Did you give it a probability?
No, we don't assign a probabilities because I don't think a decision tree will work for this this situation. You definitely need to have lots of scenarios, and a plan for the worst and hope for the best was probably the right strategy to take. So let's just say that. I would just say one of the other consequences of all the regulatory reform that I think we all just, as a practitioner, just take for granted now, but we are doing, is management teams are much more forward-looking in their approach. They are using a lot more data. There is a lot more data available, but much more forward-looking in the approach to risk management. If I think about my risk management team in London, it's grown tenfold over the last 5 years. And so I think every organisation, large banks, small banks, are all taking a very different approach to how do they plan and think about forward-looking scenarios. And so I think we take some of that for granted because we just think the reg reform process, it worked, we're all fixed, it's okay, now what's the next phase? But we have definitely taken some really good working practices with us, and I think they help you to deal with the uncertainty that you're asking about.
So what is your central scenario for Brexit now, and can you cope with a no-deal Brexit?
Well, we are coping with potentially the risk of a no-deal Brexit, but I believe that the EU leaders are all still having dinner, and so we might learn something new when we finish this session. But nobody certainly would want to trust a crystal ball or assign probabilities. Most firms just made sure that they were ready to serve their clients on the date, which may be moving and is constantly moving, to ensure that we could operate in multiple jurisdictions.
Mark, I have to ask you this, and I have waited for 25 minutes. If you're a betting man, what do you think is going to happen next? And how concerned are you about the danger of either a short-term financial market shock as a result of these multiple scenarios, as Claire says, or a long-term erosion of the city's position?
Okay. A couple points, if I may. One of the things, and I think Claire's point about forward-looking risk management, planning for the worst, hoping for the best, it's much more than words in these situations.
Yeah.
And it really is, and this is an attitudinal change that's, I think, at the core of finance, which is, okay, plan for failure, plan for something going wrong. That holds for cyber. So one of the things we look, I'll get back to Brexit in a second, but one of the things we look at for cyber is, okay, lots of work on defenses, but actually the test we're doing now of our industry, core of the industry is, okay, assume your system goes down, what are you going to do? How are you going to recover? Which is a bit akin to ending too big to fail. The question is, okay, just assume the bank, it doesn't matter what the reason is, somebody at some point will be holed below the waterline, so to speak, and the question is, how are they resolved? And how does the big global institution recover in a way that allows the system to continue on, and how does the big global institution fail in a way that allows the system as a whole to continue on? Those are the types of questions you answer. And so from a Brexit perspective, you assume, shock, no deal, and then the question is what could happen and how should the system organize itself? And look, we have been saying this, and in the full knowledge that it could actually be tested, that the core of the financial system is ready for Brexit, in the sense of it has built up capital, it's built up liquidity. The firms are doing it themselves, but we're actually getting the data as well. Are on daily liquidity monitoring. The core of the system in the UK is over £1 trillion of liquidity. They have access to more than 300 billion on top of that in all major currencies from the Bank of England if they were to need it. That actually goes for some of the asset managers to Axel's point, if they were to need it. It's not clear why they would, but if that's, again, you assume that you assume that they might, and then put yourself in a position in order to do that. A series of the big plumbing issues, and I know you know all this stuff, and there's not enough time to go into them, but have been taken off the table, so clear derivatives, a range of other issues, and we're in close contact with the European authorities around any residual issues, and particularly about, of course, the famous unknown unknowns that can happen if you have a very complicated system that has a shock. Now, there is a distinction between financial stability and market stability, and financial stability and economic stability. And if you have an economic shock, markets are going to adjust, and those adjustments could be quite substantial. But I think the test of Brexit, and you have to take my word for it at the moment, and it may not actually be tested, but has shown a big shift that has happened in the private sector, and I'd like to say in the public sector as well, as how you manage risk. Let me put it to a fine point, and a number of people here in the room lived through this, as did I. It bears no resemblance to Lehman in terms of the degree of preparation. Lehman was, yeah, it'll be all right. I mean, I'm grossly simplifying, but it was. It wasn't all the different, interconnections, and of course we learned from that experience. We all learned from it, but this is okay. I'll stop there.
Axel, would you agree that everyone's prepared for the worst and can survive a shock, like no-deal Brexit on Monday?
Well, we have taken precaution exactly along the line that was the line I always use. We have to prepare for a worst-case scenario and actually hope for a better outcome. Being a Swiss bank, we were under no illusion that whatever access we have from London to the European markets was a right granted and an access granted by the Europeans under an equivalent standard. It was not a right that you could basically rely on. And what we had to do, because London was our major operation in the European Union and Switzerland is not part of the European Union, we had to create the optionality. And I think that is really, Brexit planning is around having optionality, if and when it were to happen, that we would be able to have continuity of dealing with our clients and dealing with our book from a constituency that has market access as a granted right rather than as a commissioned favor. And so we basically on 1st of March, I signed our takeover agreement of UBS Frankfurt SE, taken over limited. We've carved out the UK business. We're prepared. Do I hope that we need to transfer on top of some organizational arrangements that we put in place, staff and operating systems? No, we don't. So we hope for an agreeable market access agreement between the UK financial institutions. In the view of banks, it's too much about trade. There's too little about financial infrastructure and financial services. Yeah. And of course, that is the key of where the concerns are. Trade is a slow-moving train. Financial services is a fast train. And therefore, you need to put in provisions, the first provision to get finance right, and then you can do everything else. Policy is negotiating this the wrong way around. They're too worried about trade. They're not, in my view, sufficiently focused on finance, and finance is an amplifier of any problem that will proliferate around the European financial sphere if not sorted out. Mark and the Bank of England have done a great job to raise that awareness with everyone else, and so we think that is understood. But unfortunately, we're not quite there. We still need an agreement with the European Union that goes beyond 1 year. We have a 40-year derivative book out there. It doesn't help me if somebody says, you know, that's okay for 1 year. So what about the rest of the 34 years? Do I need to novate the book to Frankfurt? We need grandfathering rather than transition agreement. We need grandfathering of everything that was done under EU rule in the UK to stay in place as long as the date on that contract is. Right. And we haven't got that yet. So I'm still concerned.
I didn't answer the second part of your question.
The probabilities of outcomes?
It was
Do tell us you're betting on probability.
Well, you said if I'm a betting man, I'm not a betting man, so therefore. But you asked about longer term city. And the point I'd like to make is, which goes back to architecture, which one of the challenges, and this goes from trade to financial services, is this imbalance between global rules and democratic sovereignty and accountability. And it goes to a point which Switzerland's living through, and we live through vis-a-vis Europe, but then we live through perhaps more immediately positively and constructively vis-a-vis the United States, we being the UK, which is equivalence doing exactly the same thing, or is it accomplishing the same outcome? And I would suggest that if you look at the system, financial system going forward, projecting out 10, 20 years, and irrespective of which jurisdictions it is, vis-a-vis China, for example, the Chinese are not going to do exactly this. They're not going to regulate their system exactly the same way as the UK or Canada or the United States. Provided the bits that are open, they get to the same minimum levels of financial resilience, market integrity, that's fine. That's the way the system, at least as it's developing, designed by the FSB, and that's the spirit of it. And that's the spirit of that. Those are platforms where you can have freer trade and openness in financial services. And by the way, that's how you can have freer trade in services as well, because people are not going to cut and paste exactly the same rules. Now, in a microcosm, that's part of the discussion that is not the short-term day-to-day discussion around what happens tonight, next few days, but the longer-term one, which is really a fundamental architectural discussion.
Interesting. We have a few minutes for questions, not a lot of time. Anyone who has a question, raise your hands. I think we have some roving microphones. And it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. And please keep it very brief. You have shocked them all into silence.
Shocking.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, and it looks like there aren't any questions, everyone's quite happy about the outlook for Bretton Woods and Brexit and everything else. Fabulously been so reassuring, the three of you. Let me ask a slightly different... Oh, yeah. There's a microphone just coming around here.
So I'm Hilton Root, George Mason University. So my question is, do you look at indicators such as sales of U.S. Treasuries and who participates in these as indications of some potential financial instability in the works?
It's a good question. We looked at it, I'll tell you, we looked at it a lot more closely in 2008 and GSE flows, the extent you could tell. And you need a combination of market intelligence, which sometimes is intelligence and sometimes is just anecdote and hunch, and the official data to try to parse together who's doing what.
Isn't that a scenario that one might want to prepare for? I know that there's been a lot of murmuring among this audience about the impending potential issues emerging from that problem. They see trends that they are concerned about, and it would seem to me that would be part of a scenario.
I mean, the way I would answer it is that a series of stress testing scenarios, whether from the center or by private financial institutions to my left, quite often deal with very sharp so-called snapback risk. It can be motivated by a variety of things, weird moves in the curve, up or down, deflationary or inflationary, or because caused by market technicalities, but couple standard deviation moves in order to help stress the books of banks and so irrespective of the motivation of it.
We have a question over there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Paul Applegarth. Without a working mic, I guess.
If you speak, well, I can hear you. You've got a great voice.
I usually don't need a mic, I will say. I'm coming back to this title of this session, which is the future financial structure, and I've been sitting here first. It's been very good, very interesting, but I kept thinking something is missing, and I guess what's missing is other big players in that financial architecture now and going forward. There are no non-bank financial managers here who control a tremendous amount of assets, drive a lot of financial flows, the hedge funds, the arbitrage funds, so on. Are they here and I'm not aware of it, or should they be here, and how should they come in? How do you incorporate this into this structure, which right now everybody hears of traditional institution? How do you incorporate them? Will they come in? Probably not.
Okay,
Maybe
so
unknown.
are we all too 20th century?
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question, and I apologize if we sort of alluded to it but didn't head it straight on. So I made the reference that all the capital flows to emerging economies, on net, have been from market-based finance. So that's effectively the asset management complex, a bit of hedge fund thrown in on the top to as part of it. And one of the issues that is being looked at very intensively, both from the private sector risk managers, but also from the public sector, is that these, whether mutual funds, UCITS, whatever, they're buying relatively illiquid securities. Think emerging market corporate debt under any form of stress, some forms of leveraged loans, sometimes real estate, other illiquid securities, and they're offering daily liquidity to the underlying investors. Okay, that's interesting. What are their liquidity management policies? How much, what's their ability to manage that liquidity? What rules should there be there? And it is a very active discussion because it's a coordination issue as much as anything. If you run with higher liquidity, you've got a carrying cost and you're less competitive against others, even if you think it's the right thing to do. And it's a system that hasn't been stressed or hasn't been seriously stressed. And so this is a point I was trying to make earlier on, which is this is where it gets tougher because you're talking about a counterfactual, right. Unlike in 2008, having seen banks go down and then you realize, okay, there's definitely not enough capital. Here there can be arguments that actually retail investors are very sticky and they have loss aversion. So, but this is a live issue. It's a live issue, which is, I think, pretty core to the
Well, I think that basically, we're sadly out of time now, but I think that basically cuts to very much the core of what the theme of the panel has been, which is that if you all agree that collaboration is not dead, in some ways it's needed more than ever before, not a very resounding vote of confidence that the Bretton Woods institutions will still be around in 75 years' time, but collaboration will be there. The question really is, how do you collaborate in a world where the balance of power is changing, where Asia, China is rising, where you're going to have currency realignment as a result, and when you have the old tribalism breaking down, and it's no longer just about the banks, it's also about the non-banks, and it's also about digital, which is not something which Bretton Woods institutions have dealt with at all. So it's a time of tremendous flux. So in many ways, it is absolutely a fascinating 75th year birthday. You don't just need a facelift, but you need a really quite radical bout of resurgery, if you like, for Bretton Woods. So I guess...
A makeover.
I guess I should just say, we'll finish by saying, thank you all very much indeed for your thoughts. Thank you for talking about Brexit, although I know you didn't want to. And best of luck to all of you in the room for figuring out how we have this 75-year-old creature get a real workable makeover. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.